Okay. All right. So we are officially live on our Facebook page and also in our Facebook group. So, hey guys, thank you guys for coming. I have Bonnie Galam here. She is a very, very experienced in short-term rentals attorney who is here for all of your attorney questions. So any questions that you have, just post them in the chat and I will get them to Bonnie to be answered. So I know this is going to be, I hope that you guys are going to find this really valuable because there are so many times that y'all will ask me a question. I'm like, I'm not an attorney. I can't answer that. So now we have an attorney. So I don't have to say that. I can just kick it to her and she will answer all of your attorney questions. So I might go on and just ask a few while people are rolling into the stream.
Great, let's do it.
So yeah, let's do it. So I guess my first question is the thing about LLCs. And a lot of people say you have to have an LLC for every property. What is your answer to that? Do you need to have an LLC for every property?
Oh gosh, need is a very strong word. And so no, you absolutely do not need to have a single LLC, let alone one for every single property. A lot of it comes down to like, what is your individual risk tolerance as an investor? Look, as attorneys, I'd be happy to have you pay me to create an LLC for every single property. But the reality is that a lot of people don't feel that they need that. And a lot of people just don't need that, period. There's plenty of people who invest in real estate without LLCs at all. LLCs, fun fact, are actually a fairly new invention in the terms of the law. They're only a few decades old, but landlording and things like that is something that's been going on for centuries. And so it is absolutely not a necessity, but I think they're a great, often affordable way to mitigate, to limit your risk, to limit your exposure to certain types of lawsuits. And so if it's something you're interested in, whether it's one that you put all of them in, or, maybe you scatter them, different approaches could be, I have different states for different type properties located in different states have certain LLCs, or maybe you structure it where it's like, hey, I'm willing to hold $1 million worth of assets inside of an LLC, cap it, move along. And so there's a lot of different ways you can approach it.
So would you advise to, I know every situation is going to be different, but would you advise to maybe have a few properties in an LLC or maybe cap it at $1 million in I guess, value? What do you think would be like a good, I know there's probably no rules of thumb, but I'm going to use that word.
Yeah, there's not a rule of thumb. I would say a lot of my clients kind of like that $1 million number. It feels like a nice round number. It feels like something where it's like, hey, we can kind of offset this with like a reasonable amount of insurance as well, but also appreciation is going to happen, God willing. That's what we're all hoping is going to happen. And so it's not ever going to be perfect. Don't feel like, oh my gosh, my properties appreciate. Now I need to like move them into other LLCs. You could, but don't feel that like this is like a hard and fast number by any stretch of the imagination. Some things though that I do think would warrant separate types of LLCs kind of off the bat is different types of activities, because it could affect things differently. So you may want to structure it that you've got long-term rentals in an LLC, short-term rentals in an LLC, and maybe you do flips in a different LLC. One, you're not cross-mingling that risk, but it also just may be easier come tax time for your CPA to kind of keep things organized that way, because you're going to be doing different things based off of different types of real estate assets.
So that's something else that I wanted you to touch on before we get some questions while people are still rolling in here. So how much protection from risk does an LLC actually provide?
Oh gosh, this is my favorite question in the world to get, because it's not nearly as much as I think people expect it to be, which may be a little bit surprising coming from a lawyer who makes LLCs. But I think having this clear understanding that they are not this magic bullet that will prevent all sorts of problems from happening is really important, because it lets you kind of realize where the other opportunities to protect yourself lie. In a nutshell, the way an LLC works is that it creates basically a bucket, a bubble around certain types of assets, and that the activities that are happening inside that bubble should hopefully stay contained to that bubble. Meaning, if you've got a rental property in an LLC and something goes wrong and, unfortunately a lawsuit happens, does that mean your, personal 401k is at risk? That's what we want to try to prevent happening. But also what can be nice is sometimes the inverse, depending on how you have your LLC structured, you see this strength much more in multi-member LLCs as opposed to single member LLCs, which just means you've got one person in it or two or more people in it. But what can also be nice is you can protect the LLC from things that happen in your personal life as well. So say, God forbid, you get into a car accident. Is there a way we can protect those rental properties from being recoverable in that type of a lawsuit as well? And so there's a little bit of thinking about is internal risk that happens from within the LLC, containing that to the LLC, but then also external risks. How can we prevent that from ever coming after that LLC and your ownership rights in it as well?
Okay. I still have so many questions about LLCs, but I just realized that I jumped right into the questions. I jumped the gun. I jumped into the questions before I let you introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do and what your cred is. So go ahead and do that now that we've answered a couple questions.
Sure. The way I like to, introduce myself is I'm a real estate investor who happens to be a real estate attorney. I actually was a real estate investor before I kind of put this real estate attorney hat on my head. Yes, I was already an attorney, but that wasn't my professional focus. And over time, as our portfolio grew to now what is over 100 doors, I became more and more involved in this business, not just as a deal shopper, but also as the lawyer itself. And I loved it. I found it more professionally fulfilling than what I was doing before. And so I put that hat on full time about 4 years ago, and I haven't looked back. Since then, I kind of saw, again, investor hat first, not attorney hat, was that the traditional law firm model wasn't always the way to work with an attorney. It wasn't always the most affordable way, the fastest way, or the easiest way to get from point A to point B. And so I had created an online course. We're not going to get into that right now, but to help investors kind of DIY their own legal stuff on their own time and to be able to understand all the legalities that go into being a real estate investor without having to pay, someone an hourly bill. And hopefully, by having that greater education, be able to prevent a lot of problems in the first place.
I think that is very, very valuable in not only the short-term rental world, but the real estate investing world in general, because there's so many different types of advice that people get from different attorneys who might not live in this space as an investor. There are tons of real estate attorneys out there who don't invest in any real estate, so they don't really know what it feels like to be in that driver's seat. And I think that's really important, so that because you understand how investors feel and what they're trying to accomplish, because you also do that too. So I think that's really important.
100%. And I think some of it just comes from when was I not calling my lawyer and just assuming people were not calling their lawyer in those situations as well. I don't take offense to that. I don't expect, people to have me on their speed dial, as flattering as it may be, but knowing that there's still really important legal decisions that we're making really all the time as real estate investors, and how to just make those decisions a little bit better.
Yeah, that's totally valuable. So we have kind of a specific question that I saw in our Facebook group yesterday. We had a situation where a buyer went to close on a property that is a new construction. At the time that they went under contract on the property, this is super specific, sorry, but at the time they went under contract. I love
it. It's like playing law school hypos.
Yes. So at the time they went under contract, it was not on any type of rental program, not on Airbnb or anything. It was a new construction. And by the 3 days before closing, or 2 days even, the listing agent said, oh, by the way, the seller is requiring that you take all of the future bookings. They put it on a rental program while they were under contract. And the seller said, well, you have to take all these bookings or I'm not going to show up to closing. What advice do you have for that kind of a situation?
That is a tough one. One thing I will just say, prevent this situation in the first place. One thing I always like to see in contracts, it's more of a concern I see not in this type of situation. So I wouldn't see this as a red flag that someone missed, but especially in a multifamily situation or something that has historically been used for either a long-term or short-term rental, is put in the contract, no new leases, no new tenants without the buyer's approval during the contract period. Yeah.
Great idea.
And I've never had a seller say no to that, ever. And that's usually because the contract periods we're talking about are relatively short. We're talking 90 days or less. And so their risk of vacancy is fairly low. But that being said, that's a really kind of crappy thing to do on the seller's part. especially if the buyer was not intending on doing that and the buyer was intending on perhaps using that as the personal residence in some way. That being said, this varies a little bit from state to state, but if it was going to be used by an owner occupant, that likely will trump any sort of tenant right. There may be some sort of notice that needs to be sent to these people, but usually owner occupants have some sort of trumps all right. That being said, if like someone was supposed to stay the day after, maybe not. But also, like, what is the cancellation policy from the homeowners end on these policies, looking into like, was it on Airbnb, VRBO? What do they say in terms of what happens when title transfers? Are these deals still bound? And so I think that there's probably some outs here for the buyer. If not, something I hate when these situations arise. I know you're a very experienced agent when these, at the moment of closing, problems spike up, but situations where it's like, pay me for it. You want me to inherit your problem. You want me to help inherit this situation. I need a credit at closing. And hopefully we can structure this in a way that it doesn't cause issues with the lender. But how do we compensate the buyer for this inconvenience that was kind of sprung upon them? And so I think there's ways that you can kind of creatively get around this, but oh gosh, I would have been really annoyed too. So I'm sorry I went through that.
Well, okay. So playing devil's advocate here, because a lot of times sellers think that the bookings that they make before closing is actually giving you money, when in a lot of cases, if they're putting it on some like local rental program, those bookings are not going to make you more money than if you'd book them yourself on Airbnb or Vrbo. So in that situation where you're saying, okay, well, you've inconvenienced me by making me take these bookings, you need to give me a credit or pay me for them. If the seller comes back and says, well, actually, no, because you're making money off of these bookings that I made, then what? Are they technically in breach of a contract? Since that wasn't, I don't
know that they're necessarily in breach, but something that I think would really kind of be a turning point on this is whether, like, what was the buyer's intended use? Is the buyer's intended use to continue using this as a short-term rental? And they're just like, look, I'm leaving money on the table by taking these rentals versus mine, which is not the greatest argument for the buyer. Whereas someone who I'd say like the complete opposite end of the spectrum would be an owner occupant who's like, I'm moving in here with my kids tomorrow. What do you mean 60 days from now, someone's going to be like sleeping in my bed? Like that just doesn't make sense. And so figuring out where on that spectrum, because the law does get that kind of minutia where it will look at like, what are both people's signs? Did the buyer have any reason to know that this was being used or was being marketed as a short-term rental? Something else to kind of ask, again, not so much in this exact fact pattern because it was a new construction, like that's just wackadoo to me, but a situation where perhaps there is some sort of history of rentals, asking that question up front so you can negotiate future rentals in advance is, always recommended, because if you can negotiate or cancel this stuff from the outset, it's easier than obviously finding it at the time of closing.
Awesome. So appreciate that. All right. So another question from the chat. Other than putting properties in LLCs, what other ways can property owners protect themselves as hosts, such as guest injuries on the property?
That is a great question, Levi. And it's something that I really, really love, because LLCs are what I call defensive asset protection. They're only there to protect you if and when things go wrong, and they don't do anything to prevent these problems from happening in the first place, which is the ideal situation we want to be in. And that side of asset protection is what I've coined offensive asset protection. And so in that realm, guest injuries off the bat, do you have a waiver? And I think waivers are huge, 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 huge. If you have any sort of like perk with the property. Do you have ATVs? Do you have canoes? Do you have a trampoline? Like what, if your property has something where it's like, this is risky, bicycles, scooters, like whatever the case may be, get a waiver. Be like, hey, you use this stuff at your own risk. We provide it here, maybe even take it to the next level. Say if it's broken, like that doesn't mean we have to reduce the price, things like that, where that there's going to be that next level of problems. It's probably more likely someone would complain that the item is not in the condition they wanted than that they're going to get hurt on it. But the risk is much greater with some sort of an injury. And so waivers, huge when it comes to guest injuries. Also, looking at if you've got some sort of turnover service or cleaning service, making sure that they are properly licensed and insured, and indemnifying you, the owner, in the way that you need to be if they're the one who screwed something up. They left a bucket on the stairs, someone tripped on it going up or down. You want the cleaning company who left that bucket to have to deal with that, not you. That doesn't mean you're not getting sued, because I can tell you, you are. Everybody gets sued. But you want, at the end of the day, the person who comes out of pocket to be the person who's truly wrong. And so whether it's a landscaper, your turnover people, and so that means, sometimes paying a premium to make sure you're not working with, people who are getting paid in cash off the table. You want to make sure you truly have licensed and insured, and if necessary, like commercially insured cleaning and, turnover people who you're dealing with. So those would be two quick things I would say. Legit people who are helping you out with the business, and also get waivers, and insurance is great too. Make sure you're properly and adequately insured on your own end. And again, I'm taking this from the standpoint of short-term rentals. With long-term rentals, there's obviously a lot of other things we can do as well.
Okay. And what about, so you mentioned people who are getting paid in cash under the table. There are a lot of vendors in a lot of different markets who want to be paid under the table. So in situations like that, where you're trying to protect your huge investment as a host, and say, the cleaner left a mop bucket out and somebody fell, what do you need to do up front with your cleaners to make sure, or any vendor that's going to be in there, because anybody can make a mistake or negligence or whatever, and somebody can get hurt. So how do you recommend getting around that, since a lot of them really do want to be paid under the table and there might not be an option?
Sure. And so payment is less of an issue. I'm just raising as like, that's usually the red flag, that there may be some other concerns about the legitimacy of the business. And so here's what I would say to that. One, paying someone in cash is not an issue. That's between themselves, God, and the IRS. What they do with that money, not a concern to you. You keep adequate records so you can properly expense it. And ideally, they're legit enough that they're allowing you to like 1099 them. But what you want to also be thinking about is you want to see copies of their insurance. You don't want to just see like on their truck, licensed and insured. You want to see copies of their insurance. And ideally, you should be added, especially if this is someone who you're planning on having long-term relationships with, get added as an additional insured to their policy. That sounds like it's expensive. It costs them nothing. They just tell their insurance is basically giving you a certificate that their insurance is there. It's active, but most importantly, if it changes or it gets canceled, you'll get notified of that as well. And so getting listed as an additional insured, huge. If it's something that they require licensing, I realize a lot of turnover services are different than like a contractor or an electrician who would need some sort of state licensing. And so I'm going to just kind of harp on the insurance here instead. But the cash is less of an issue as much as the insurances, because that is ideally what's going to indemnify you. The other thing that you want to look for when it comes to, say, like these turnover services is having a contract with them. You don't want it to just be like, hey, that they send you a Venmo request once a week or once a month or something like that. You want there to be something from the outset that says things like they're not your employee. And so if someone gets hurt on your property, you don't owe them workers' comp. Ideally, you're seeing their workers' comp policy alongside with their general liability policy. You also want to be, outlining things like, what is the scope of their work? What is the term of the relationship? What does the cancellation, like all of these terms that make a difference and make sure that they're doing what they need to do to uphold their end of their job and you're paying them appropriately to do so, is all kind of outlined there. So those would be the two additional things. Get those insurance policies, workers' comp, general liability, get added as additional insured, and have some sort of contract. Invoices are not contracts. And so you want to have something that outlines the scope.
Okay, super helpful. Here's another one from the chat. If I have a partnership with a family member, is an LLC recommended?
Look, I want to, again, LLCs, I realize they're not always for everyone, just because not everyone's financing allows for LLCs. I would hate for someone to be like, I can't be a real estate investor because I'm using FHA and therefore I can't have an LLC, therefore I can't invest in real estate. So I will never say an LLC is a must, ever. That being said, when you have a partner, you have an additional risk person involved in your business. And so does it hurt? No. In fact, multi-member LLCs are even stronger than single member LLCs due to that protection we talked about earlier, the external protection, being able to protect the LLC from what's going on in your personal lives. God forbid your family member goes through a divorce, a bankruptcy. How can we protect your joint interest in this property from whatever's going wrong in their life? That being said, absolutely do not pass go. I don't care if this person's your mother. You need to have an agreement with them. You need to have an agreement, a partnership agreement. If you don't have an LLC, if you do have an LLC, it's called an operating agreement. You need to have something that outlines your relationship with that person. And it needs to be legit. Talking about, what is the tax structure of this? What is the, equity sharing? And to keep memorializing this, I've had a situation where it was people who were best men at each other's weddings, and now they're suing each other. It's like a six-figure lawsuit because there was in partnership dispute, and they bought properties together, and they never had anything in writing other than the fact that they were jointly on title to some of these properties. Some of the problems were that they weren't. Someone was the only one on title, and the other one just put sweat equity in, and they had nothing on paper. And like, how do you then prove that? How do you prove that you ever did anything? And so absolutely keep records and get yourself an agreement. LLCs may or may not make sense. I don't think they will ever hurt unless they're holding you back from being able to acquire the property.
And Luke has joined us. Bonnie, I don't know if you know Luke. He runs all the education stuff at the short-term shop. He is our management ninja, teaches everyone how to manage their properties. And he's the GOAT. So I know Luke probably has some questions too.
I do, yes. I'm the on-field correspondent, if you will. What's the name of that lady? Anyway, yeah. So
Wolfie on Howard Stern.
Who?
Wolfie.
Wolfie, yeah, Wolfie. And a Baba Booey to you. Anyway, so talk to me. You may have already covered this, but like, how do I structure? Did you talk about structuring LLCs, holding companies, etc.?
No, we didn't. That's great. So go ahead.
So
yeah.
when does a holding company come into play, and how do I know if I need one? Let's say I'm having multiple entities here, like I have 6 apartment buildings and 27 short-term rentals. How do I structure that? Do I just have individual LLCs? Does it matter? Depend on what state I'm in, etc.?
Look, some of this, I think, are going to get different opinions from different lawyers and probably different opinions from CPAs on this. My approach to entity structuring is keep it simple, stupid. If I can't keep it straight in my QuickBooks, if I can't keep it straight in my head, I'm not going to keep it straight to keep it organized to be able to maintain the asset protection that these entities are supposed to give me in the first place. And so I very much just like having one row of LLCs, if you think about it that way. That being said, there may be times, especially from a tax perspective, where it makes sense to have something on top. Does that hurt? No. Does it increase your tax bill? Like your CPA fees? Yes, usually it will increase your CPA fees, but there could be reasons why it's tax beneficial to do those types of things. And so I will often like to structure those types of decisions in conjunction with my client CPAs, but also there could be reasons, and I will say they're often different for real estate investors as opposed to like a company like Target, who has, this holding company, or you think of Google has their holding company, which I don't even know what that's called anymore. And there's Meta. And what these companies do is that they have like distinct branches to them, where maybe they have, the Facebook component and then the Instagram component, and they have their charitable component and maybe a lobbying component. And so all these things are kind of separate from each other. And so for them, it makes sense to kind of separate them out. And when you think about that in the inverse for real estate investors, like we don't always have like a charitable arm to our short-term rental portfolio that would require having a separate entity so it could be treated separately from a tax perspective, but still under this umbrella of all of our wonderful real estate investing that we do. And so I wouldn't say that there's any sort of hard and fast rules here. A lot of times things can be kind of consolidated for organization using things like trusts for like estate planning purposes. But I hope that answered your question. I don't want to just ramble on about the holding companies and things like that for no additional reason. There may also be some like state specific Often it comes back again to tax reasons why you may do that, because maybe you have one company that has an S Corp election and one that doesn't, but they're under this umbrella. And you can kind of offset the incomes from one another due to the fact that they're in this umbrella. It kind of comes back down to tax and those numbers. And so when your CPA suggests it, I'd say like red flag. Until then, I would use that as a kind of question point and push back on attorneys that suggest it, only because it's a fee hiker. That's how I look at it. Does it hurt? Only because you're paying professionals probably more than you need to in terms of the like ROI of asset protection benefit. Quick exception, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of series LLCs. They're only available in about a dozen states, but series LLCs are kind of this very new entity. They're like 10 years old or so. And I think they're very interesting. I think there's something worth following as a real estate investor. And I think if they're available in your state and you're investing in states that also have and recognize series LLCs, that's a conversation worth having.
Yes, I was going to lead you right into Series LLC because they are available in
one step ahead of you.
In a weird thing is they're available in what I would consider to be kind of old school states like Tennessee and Alabama.
Yeah.
But
it's a revenue generator for them. Think about it. I mean, like, why is there like this like sexy Wyoming LLC? It's Wyoming. Like,
right.
What? Who cares? But they get a bunch of LLC filings there. It's a revenue generator for the state. They've got this. I call them the designer bag LLCs. By and large, they do the same thing that any other LLC would do with maybe like a little bit of extra anonymity. And I don't love anonymity. I don't think it's a game worth chasing. It can get very expensive to try to completely hide yourself. And so that being said, does it hurt to have one in Wyoming? No. Do you need to have one in Wyoming? No.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because a lot of times when I hear people say, I've got my Wyoming LLC, I instantly think to myself, oh, you have no clue what you're doing. Like, what are you even going to use it for? Well, I don't know. I read somewhere that Wyoming was the best one. Well,
and then you still have to register it in whatever state you hold property in. And so it's just like, whatever.
And is the property in, but anyway.
They got some good marketing over there in Wyoming. What can I say?
Yeah, I will say the series is a little easier to kind of organize. I think that's the whole point of it anyway. At least that's my take on it, where you can just it's almost like a little mini holding company, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like a little mini holding company. And like the IRS says, there's not a lot of law on this. They're so new. Like the IRS is like, what do we do with this like thing that the states have made up? Where like in theory, like it's kind of like a hub and spoke, but not really. Where you could kind of treat things differently, but that in general is supposed to be, I think, a more affordable from like an administration cost standpoint way of putting one property per LLC without really having to put one property per LLC, because you buy this one or form this one series LLC, and then you could put unlimited number of series within it. And so say a regular LLC cost you $100, a series LLC cost you $500, but then you've got all these options. And so I definitely think the series LLC is not a gimmick. I think it is very limited right now. I don't think we know the scope of exactly how it will be treated in like cross state lines still, just because there haven't been a lot of lawsuits involving them for us to have the case law to understand really what these do in the way that like LLCs are like 30, 40 years old at this point. Everybody has an LLC. Everybody's getting sued in LLCs. We know the ins and outs of how they're going to hold up in court, whereas we don't quite know that in series LLCs. I totally have my eyes all over it. I think they're worth watching, but there's still like a question mark there of like, how's this actually going to shake out?
Yeah, my take on
it. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, my take on it is exactly what you said. It's like, if you're trying to avoid paying a filing fee for 72 entities and they're all in the same state and they allow series, then just get the series and you don't have to pay all those filing fees is basically.
Yeah, that's what I see it. And I'm like, and as long as all of those properties are in that state, like say you have like a Tennessee series LLC or a Delaware one, would I then go hold that property in New Jersey in my Tennessee LLC? I'm like, it probably wouldn't hurt, but it's probably just going to be treated as a regular LLC. I don't know if all those series are going to be recognized as truly separate entities in a state like New Jersey that doesn't have an equivalent entity.
Or you could have the Tennessee series that is owned by the Wyoming holding company, and then
inside of a land trust. Like why?
Right, exactly.
Okay, we got a couple questions in the chat that I want to get to.
Aaron Andrews, by the way, is the on-field correspondent name that I was looking for earlier. Anybody was on the seat of their
doppelganger? Is that your doppelganger?
I don't even know who you're talking about.
That's not right either. What is it? The seat, edge of your seat. Thank you. Go ahead, Avery.
If you're on the seat of your pants.
If you're on the seat of your pants.
About what Luke is saying. Okay. Ethan says, if I'm looking for a good real estate attorney, how do I know if they're good? If I, need to hire one?
That's a hard one because I've seen a lot of, even in my own experience, I've worked with not so great attorneys, and I have been on the other side of like transactions dealing with not so great attorneys. And so some questions I would ask are about things like their workflow, like what is their communication timeline? Will you be communicating with them or a paralegal? What is their practice breakdown in terms of how much of their practice is focused on real estate? Because real estate is an area, particularly among lawyers, where we kind of feel like we can dabble in it. And so you get a lot of generalists who will do your traffic ticket and do your divorce and do your real estate closing. That's probably not the person that you want, especially as a real estate investor. That may work for like, you know, Joe Schmo who's buying, you know, a residential house that they plan on living in for 30 years. Still probably wouldn't recommend it. I always think if you have a specialist, work with a specialist. But being able to see like, oh, this person does 80%, you know, transactional real estate and 20% landlord tenant, like they are just all real estate, like that is a good sign. Seeing where these people are active, like if you meet someone who's like 80-20, like I just said, and you met them at your local RIA, that's probably a good sign. See if you can find some of their clients to talk to. A funny thing about lawyers is that we can't tell you who our clients necessarily are. It's privileged. And so I can't be like, oh, this big, you know, name developer is my client. Does not give me instant street cred. We can't really do that. And so you kind of have to figure that out on your own. And it's kind of crappy, but like, that's why you may see like on lawyers' websites, it's like, we work with, you know, on these types of deals, and see if their website says that. Like, what does their website look like? Does it look like Joe Schmo who does everything? Or does it say like, hey, like these are the types of deals I've done in the last year? And ask them, how many deals have you done in the last year? How many properties have you closed on? If you're looking for like a closing type of attorney, if you're looking for someone with asset protection, like how many investors do you work with? What is the breakdown of investors versus traditional retail buyers who you're working with? Getting a sense of that, because some people do not want to work with investors. And as an investor myself, I take great offense to that, but it's the reality. Like sometimes we're trickier. We have more creative problems that need more creative solutions. And you can't just kind of pawn us off to your paralegal. Like we actually need attorney attention. And so figuring out that breakdown as well. That being said, someone like I know myself, I had a very heavy investor practice, but I still had a high, you know, retail volume as well. And just kind of figuring out where you fit into that mix is important.
See, my problem with that is that a lot of folks, it seems like they, you know, at least in the real estate world, what I'm familiar with, they get into this and they're like, okay, I need an LLC, and they don't even know why. And then they go online and they Google, do I need an LLC for real estate? And they find like the most popular influence, most YouTube click person out there. And then they call their firm, and their firm, like, you know, drops
Charges
the ball
them
or doesn't want to talk to them, or gives them the wrong answer, or whatever the case may be. And then that person, that poor little person that doesn't know any better, is like, oh, I don't need to know, you know, like they just stop there, and you can't do that. You know, you got to keep calling around until you find a good fit. And I guess that's my question, is how do I find a good fit? I had success a couple of times with CPA recommendations, because obviously those two aspects of the business need to be talking to each other. The LLC, you know, the entities and the tax filings need to be cohesive. So how many phone calls do I need to make, and how do I find somebody that's a good fit?
Hopefully not too many, but you brought up a really good point there. I don't love realtor referrals for attorneys, because there's also been like this like weird, like personal, not necessarily work quality based relationship there. And that's not a dig on agents. It's just that like attorneys need agents. And so we can't give kickbacks, but like I say a little bit of a conflict of interest there. Whereas like CPAs and stuff, I feel like other professionals do kind of have a better sense of like who can actually get the job done, if you're talking about things from like an asset protection standpoint. When it comes to like, I'll call like the asset protection kind of guru lawyers who are out there, I don't want to say they're a real problem. I know a lot of people are very happy with them, but I've also seen a lot of people like get super burned. They've got like one property worth $100,000 and they spend $30,000 to protect it with them. And then they have to pay $10,000 a year to maintain it. Like that just doesn't make sense. And some of this has to just be, you know, you as a consumer. I mean, that's why I created my program, Landlord Law School, was to kind of create this like baseline level of education. But also, like, you have to just kind of understand the math of your portfolio. This is how much my assets are worth if we're talking about it from like a net worth value. This is how much it spins off. How much is that worth, you know, protecting to me? And like these, you know, lawyers who will come at it with a place of fear mongering will be like, oh my God, it's $100,000. Like, wouldn't you spend 10,000 for an ROI of 100,000? That gives you 10,000 every year. Perhaps, but like if there was an alternative that cost you $1,000 once, and then, you know, your tax return, like knowing what options are out there is always going to be the responsibility of the consumer. And just not falling for marketing or scare tactics. Scare tactics are a really big thing with lawyers. I don't love it. I don't think that we should be preying on people's fears to be able to sell them anything in terms of like legal services. And so get that vibe from people. If you got a vibe from an attorney where it's just like, hey, I feel like I'm being scared into doing something or pressured into doing something like today, then take a step back. Just take a step back and get another referral.
Unless that realtor is Avery and only works with investors, then it's probably a good lead. But you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's where that came from, is like, okay, I got this real estate agent gave me a lawyer's, and then you're like, oh, this came from a real estate agent. That's because the people that are coming from a CPA are generally maybe going to be like another step or two.
Yeah, they may be, especially on like a transactional end. One thing that I like, and I know a lot of realtors did for me, is that there was a list of 3, and I didn't take offense. I was usually number 1 on that list, but a list of 3, and people will call me and they may say, hey, look, Avery gave me 2 other names. And so let me give you a call, give you a call back, and I'll let you know. And people just get a vibe. Like, does this sound like someone who I want to work with or not? And I think it's great for someone to kind of give like a closed list of options and be like, hey, these are 3 people. All 3 of them will get the deal done. They're all pretty close price point. They all just have kind of different styles. Like, I use heavily Zoom. Some attorneys want you to physically come into their office. Some attorneys, are going to say like, hey, we're going to touch point at these points, but you're really going to be dealing with my paralegal, but I'm going to oversee everything. And so getting a feel for like, what is just the vibe and what are the expectations that I want from this attorney? Don't be afraid to ask them to explain the process to you. Like, what is it going to look like working with you? Whether that is to just form an LLC or to do a transaction with them or to create a lease, like what does that process look like? And 1, they should have a process and be able to explain that to you. But 2, you should also be able to get a sense of like how involved you will need to be or not need to be. Because I think that's sometimes a surprise with people when working with attorneys, just because we don't usually do that a whole lot until we start getting into real estate. Unless you've had, to get divorced, or maybe you've had a parent pass away. Lawyers are not something that most people deal with, 1, for happy occasions, like something like investing in real estate. And 2, like there can be a level of intimidation, which is unfortunate, but I get it. It's real. Lawyers can be, kind of put ourselves like up on the mountaintop of knowledge that like we'll talk to you to you about things. And some people really like that. Like some people are like, yes, that means you're credible. And some people are like, if you dropped an F-bomb on a call, that wouldn't bother me. And so don't suggest doing that if any lawyers are listening to this. I don't think that's good marketing practice, but like you get my vibe when I say that there's,
if you don't like F-bombs,
styles, there's a million ways to skin a cat.
Okay, we've got an interesting one in the chat about disclosing. So if I purchased a home and found later that something inside the home was faulty when I purchased it, is there anything I can do about that?
So a lot of this will depend on disclosures and disclosure laws in your state. Most states will require sellers to disclose what are known latent defects, meaning problems that they know are in the property that are not readily apparent to a buyer who was just kind of walk through the property. And you have to disclose that before going under contract. And so that could be things like, hey, when it rains, it leaks in the basement. And so if you don't inspect the property on a rainy day, you won't ever notice that wet corner. It could be things like there's mold behind drywall and we painted over it. Like, don't do that. That would be fraud. And so some of it is like, did the seller have a duty to disclose this? more often than not, and this is really frustrating, is it's either A, your inspector missed something, which you could go after your inspector. Plenty of people sue inspectors. I'm sorry if my friend who is a home inspector is listening to this. I'm not encouraging it, but like inspectors are not flawless and they have insurance for a reason. But I'd say the third and probably honest to God most common situation is like houses have problems, things go wrong, and it's not anybody's fault. It stinks. And so without knowing exactly like what the situation of something was faulty, say it was like an HVAC system that, the pilot light doesn't turn on and it's now winter, you inspected the home in the summer and you didn't test the heat because it was the summer. And now you're finding this out. I don't know that that is necessarily like a fraud situation. Another thing to kind of look at is whether the contract was as is or not, which pushes a lot more inspection responsibilities onto the buyer. It does not relieve the seller to disclose any defects, but it does kind of say like, take it or leave it in a sense.
Yeah. And that's the approach that I've kind of taken over the years is like, well, I mean, welcome, like there's stuff that happens with houses and you might've bought something that was totally fine when you bought it. And 2 days after you buy it, the toilet explodes.
That happened to me. I think we talked about that before.
I think, yeah, that was
like
you.
Literally
that was
the day after closing, toilet exploded, like the flange failed, flooded, like, thankfully we caught it early, but it like flooded that bathroom floor. Another thing to kind of think about just from like a practical standpoint is when things like this go wrong, these are not situations like say you purchase the property in an LLC and you have insurance and everything is going great. None of those things are going to cover you here. And so this is the type of a lawsuit where you are coming out of pocket to hire a lawyer to fix it for you. And if this is because I will get these calls all the time, it's $1,000 issue, a $2,500 issue, even a $5,000 issue, I say, take it up in small claims court. Most small claims courts are they're pro se, meaning user friendly. You can go to court without an attorney and handle this yourself because any litigation attorney's retainer is going to likely be higher than that. It's not worth paying an attorney $5,000 to solve a $2,500 problem. Bad math. And so what do we have to do as investors is kind of like either eat it, you can take it up in small claims court, or see if there is some sort of fraud. Sometimes when there's a fraud situation, either on part of the seller or an agent's part, there is a fee shifting statute involved, meaning winner gets their attorney's fees paid for by the loser. But that's not the case in like most just general like disclosure type of things.
Yeah. And I mean, it would have to be really bad for me to even take the time to go to small claims court. Like if something 2,500, even 5,000
to be.
Yeah. Even 5,000. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to do this. I don't have time to go. There's very few properties that I buy that are like down the street from my house. So I'm not driving from Florida to Tennessee to deal with that. Like, all right, cool. Cost of doing business.
Right. Like lesson learned. I'll give you two examples of situations where I had, where there were lawsuits that came out of it. The first was a situation where the seller said that there was a parking space included with the property. There was signage. Turns out post-closing, the seller hung these fraudulent signs. There was no parking involved with the property. Parking was like a premium in this location. And so like the property instantly day after closing was instantly worth like $40,000 less than what they just purchased it for. And so their fraud, high quantity of value, like they couldn't sell the house. They were immediately underwater on it. And so there's an example. Another example was a bad flip. Bad flip, hung drywall all over. They finished a basement and covered all sorts of mold. They discovered it like a week after closing. That this was not like 6 months after closing. Was it the seller? Was it not the seller? It was like immediate after closing. They go down there, they see a wet spot, they chip, like it falls off and there's just mold everywhere, and new drywall. And they knew it was new drywall because of like, you could see like the stamp on it. And so it was like a $60,000 problem to tear down, unfinish this basement, waterproof it, and put it back into place. They're like, that's not something you necessarily want to eat, especially when you've got the proof behind it. And the sellers were like, newly finished waterproof basement in the listing. Like these types of things, like you need to have the proof. And so that's those dang things about lawsuits. You need to be able to prove like who did it and who caused it.
Yeah. And I think that that's another kind of thing that you don't really want to deal with either is there's a lot of times, even if a seller did know something, you have to be able to prove that they knew it, which is sometimes hard to do.
Right. Like the fact that we had this like smoking gun of like stamps on the drywall that were like 30 days before closing. Like it was no doubt that the seller put this drywall on. It was no doubt that like the mold had already proliferated the entirety of the exterior of this house. And they also said it was waterproofed and there was no evidence of any sort of like waterproofing behind the drywall, anything like that. There was no insulation, nothing. And so getting able to prove this stuff in court is tricky. I will say it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. I hear this misinterpreted a lot. Beyond a reasonable doubt just for criminal law. For civil law, it is a different standard where it's basically more likely than not, 51%. So it's not like this insurmountable hurdle, but like 51% is still like getting a jury on board with that much can be really tricky as well.
Yeah, none of that sounds like anything I want to bother with.
No, it's not.
I think we've got another question in the chat here. If I'm operating my rental through a property management company I own, that is also an LLC, does that offer any protection even if the title on those properties is still my name?
Yes, like I said before, everybody's still getting sued. But the big thing that you need to have done, and I see this one missing a lot with investors who have just like property management LLC, which is like, I get it. It's a convenience. You filter, you know, all of the revenue, no matter where the property's from, through this LLC from a convenience standpoint. But a lot of investors forget to get insurance on that LLC. There is, you know, probably no asset in it, right? We're not holding any physical property in there. It's probably got money in there very quick. It's probably going in there and then out to the other LLCs if that's how you're structuring your income flow. But you're also the one probably with the risk. Like you're the responsible for cleaning or snow removal or landscape, whatever the case may be. It's like the condition of the property is the responsibility of that property management company. And so make sure it has liability insurance. The other thing is make sure you have an agreement between yourself and yourself. Like you have to hire this property management company if you want it to be the one to eat it for you, essentially. And so if you don't have any sort of arrangement, just having the money filter through there, I wouldn't make that as an assumption that like, oh, obviously this is the one that's responsible. Again, we need to have some sort of proof, like they're responsible. They have an indemnity to protect these holding companies or their clients. And they have, you know, adequate insurance. And this is what they're responsible for. And if you want them to be responsible for basically everything that can go wrong, you have to list that out. Otherwise, it's going to assume it's going to be the homeowner's problem. And so can that be used as an asset protection tool? Yes, you just have to do it right.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. Let's see, we don't have any more in the chat. Is there anything that you feel like the people watching might need to know that hasn't been asked?
What I think is really important in order to kind of level up on what I call that offensive asset protection, meaning the preventative asset protection, as opposed to the reactive kind of popping up when things go wrong, LLCs, insurance type of thing, is to actually really pay attention to your business. Take note of when things are going good and when things are going wrong. And I say, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And so after things go wrong, immediately go in your business and change it. For us, it's not always things that go wrong. Sometimes it's things that feel clunky, like, oh, or that was just like an awkward situation I don't want to deal with again. Like, what policy do I need to put in place? What term do I need to add to a lease if you're using leases? What should I add to my waiver? What should I add to my listings to make this clear that this is my terms for the property? So that way we're just constantly improving, and continuing to protect ourselves by eliminating the possibility of this stuff coming up. Don't ever think that your business is set it and forget it. And I don't mean to say that in terms of like, oh my gosh, the overwhelm, but in terms of like the opportunity that like, if you look at this from the perspective of a business, then, and I love giving the example of like the pizza parlor or the hospital. Like think of hospitals, like they get sued all the time. They're not in a Wyoming LLC. What do they do to protect themselves? They've got protocols, they got insurance out the wazoo, and they're constantly improving on their processes to make it more streamlined and a less risky situation. This is not like saying that America's healthcare system is like whatever. I'm probably right after this call going to go sit for 2 hours at the pediatrician's office. But you get the point where it's like, if we look at this from a business and how can we constantly fine tune it, that is the greatest legal opportunity that I think you have to protect yourself, more so than any like designer bag entity.
Well, mic drop on that. Thank you so much for coming on and answering everybody's questions, Bonnie. If the people who are watching want to learn more about you, find your content, your course, all that stuff, where can they find you?
Sure. You can go to my website, which is just my name, bonniegalam.com. You can follow me on Instagram. That's where I spend too much time, at Bonnie Galam, ESQ, which stands for Esquire. And yeah, those two places. I also have a podcast called Good Bones Real Estate Investing that drops every week with legal tips for real estate investors.
Awesome. I'm going to go subscribe to that now. Well, thanks again so much for coming on, and we'll catch you later.
Sounds good. Bye for now.